Snow blew sideways across the high ridges of the Caucasus, blinding the men who struggled forward through drifts that swallowed their legs to the thigh. The wind was sharp enough to cut exposed skin, and it carried the bitter sound of men coughing, stumbling, and calling out for officers they couldn't see in the dark. Lanterns swung in the storm like dying stars. Rifles froze in soldiers' hands, and along the mountainside, the columns of the Ottoman Third Army dissolved into the white void, as if the land itself were consuming them. What had started as a bold winter offensive was turning into something far worse, an operation collapsing under its own weight, one frozen hour at a time. The plan had been ambitious from the start. Enver Pasha, one of the most powerful leaders in the Ottoman Empire, believed he could strike a decisive blow against Russia by surrounding and crippling the large garrison at Sarikamish. He imagined a rapid winter march through the mountains, catching the Russians by surprise and proving the renewed strength of his army. Officers who warned him about the terrain, the weather, and the lack of proper winter clothing were ignored. Enver wanted speed, daring, and victory. What he got instead was a nightmare unfolding in slow, freezing motion. The opening days of the operation in December 1914 showed brief signs of promise. Ottoman units pushed toward the passes, advancing through villages and along narrow ridges dusted with snow. But as the army climbed higher into the Caucasus, the conditions deteriorated quickly. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Snowfall thickened until visibility shrank to a few yards. The mountain paths turned treacherous, narrowing into ledges where a misplaced step meant a fatal drop. Soldiers wearing thin uniforms and worn boots tried to keep formation as the wind drove into them with unrelenting force. The columns began to break apart as men lost contact with their officers. Maps became useless in the storm. Food supplies froze solid. Mules collapsed on the trail. Some soldiers huddled together behind rocks, hoping the weather would pass. Others pushed on in silence, their faces glazed with ice. Those who fell often never got back up. Patrols found men sitting upright in the snow, eyes open, rifles still across their knees, frozen where they had stopped to rest. By the time the vanguard approached the outskirts of Sarikamish, many units had already taken severe losses without firing a shot. The Russian defenders, expecting an attack but not fully prepared for one, rallied quickly once they realized the Ottoman formations were arriving in broken fragments instead of coordinated waves. Reinforcements arrived by rail, and the Russian command tightened defenses around the town. Machine guns were placed at strategic points along the forested slopes. What Enver had hoped would be a quick seizure hardened into a brutal fight for every building and trench. Inside the deep snow, the battle turned chaotic. Ottoman soldiers who reached the outskirts of Sarikamish fought fiercely, engaging Russian troops in close combat among pine trees, heavy with frost. But many attackers arrived exhausted, half-frozen, and without support from other units still scattered along the mountain trails. Ammunition supplies ran dangerously low. The cold was so severe that rifles jammed repeatedly, and soldiers had to warm them under their coats to keep them working. The wounded had almost no chance of survival. Stretchers froze stiff, and the snow-covered ground made every step harder. Enver, still believing victory was within reach, ordered repeated assaults. Each one cost more men. Each one returned fewer. The Russian forces, now fully reinforced, counterattacked with precision, pushing the weakened Ottoman battalions back toward the forests where they had come from. Snowstorms continued to sweep across the ridges, erasing trails and burying bodies almost as fast as they fell. The retreat, when it came, was not a single decision, but a gradual collapse. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Some units tried to dig shallow shelters into the drifts, only to find the ground frozen solid. Others wandered off course, stumbling into ravines or circling back along their own tracks. Frostbite ate through fingers and toes. Entire companies disappeared during the night. Survivors later described seeing long lines of bodies half buried in the snow, men curled together for warmth that never came, their uniforms stiff with ice. Those who made it back toward the lower slopes faced new dangers. Russian patrols harried the retreating forces, firing from positions hidden by the storm. Artillery shells burst across the mountainsides, sending clouds of ice and debris into the air. The Ottoman soldiers were too weak to mount coordinated resistance. Many simply kept walking until their strength gave out. By early January 1915, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. What had begun as a massive winter offensive had effectively destroyed the Ottoman Third Army. Tens of thousands were dead, most of them not from bullets or shell fire, but from cold, exposure, and exhaustion. Reports spoke of men found frozen side by side, still in marching formation. Others lay scattered across the ridges where snowdrifts had quietly covered them. Survivors who returned to Erzurum staggered into the city with blackened limbs, frost-bitten faces, and hollow eyes. Some walked into aid stations without speaking a word, collapsing the moment they reached shelter. Enver Pasha, shaken but unwilling to accept full responsibility, blamed everything from poor discipline to local Kurdish tribes. But the truth was impossible to hide. Officers who had begged him to delay the offensive were devastated by what they had witnessed. Russian accounts confirmed that the majority of Ottoman deaths occurred far from direct combat. The mountains had done the killing long before soldiers met on the battlefield. In Istanbul, news of the losses spread slowly, softened by official statements that tried to frame the retreat as temporary. But on the front, the consequences were immediate. The Ottomans would never again mount an offensive of that scale in the Caucasus. The Russian army, though also suffering harsh winter casualties, held its position firmly until later in the war. The remnants of the Third Army spent the following months rebuilding, absorbing new recruits to replace the thousands who never came back. Villagers near the mountain passes would continue finding bodies for years after the battle, uncovered by shifting snow or meltwater. Some were identified, many were not. Today, the ridges around Sarikamish look quiet under winter skies, the snow smooth and untouched in places where entire battalions once fought for survival. The cold remains just as dangerous, the mountains just as unforgiving. But unless you already know the story, there is nothing in the landscape to show where so many men froze, where the wind swallowed their voices, or where ambition outpaced the reality of winter in the Caucasus. What remains is the memory of an army undone by conditions it was never prepared to face, marching into a storm it could not overcome, guided by leaders who refused to believe nature could outweigh strategy. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.